with United Nations theories about alleged man-made global warming imploding on the world stage, regimes oppressing populations in poorer nations are demanding that taxpayers in wealthier countries start promptly handing over trillions of dollars a circumflex supposedly to deal with a circumflex climate change. A circumflex, gathered in Warsaw, Poland, at the latest UN A Circumflex Climate Summit, and facing massive public protests against the extortion effort, governments are hoping to quickly and quietly lay the foundations for a new global treaty rationing carbon dioxide. Multiple nations and populations are becoming increasingly suspicious as the UN's discredited theories are ridiculed by top scientists and experts worldwide, so a circumflex climate dignitaries know they must act fast. Indeed, if what countless scientists refer to as the global warming a circumflex schema crumbles entirely before 2015, the effort to foist a planetary a circumflex carbon budget on humanity to replace the Kyoto Protocol may be doomed. The hundreds of billions spent on a circumflex climate schemes every year would inevitably start drying up, too, bankrupting countless special interests that now depend on global warming alarmism and hysteria. Already, the new Australian government has vowed to reject UN circumflex socialism masquerading as environmentalism as it works to dismantle wildly unpopular a circumflex carbon taxes and a circumflex climate machinations imposed under Labour Party rule. It also vowed not to adopt any more taxes or spend any more taxpayer funds on UN wealth redistribution schemes orchestrated under the bogus guise of fighting discredited notions of a circumflex man-made global warming. A circumflex, of course, alarmists are throwing a temper tantrum, but around the world and among Australians, the new conservative-leaning coalition has been hailed for its bold stance against the hysteria. Analysts even say Australia is leading the way back to sanity. Japanese authorities, meanwhile, recently announced that instead of working to drastically cut carbon dioxide emissions, as previously promised, Japan will actually be increasing its CO2 output. As UN global warming theories increasingly morph into a global laughingstock, even Russian and Canadian officials are reportedly putting up some tepid resistance to the UN's grandiose a circumflex climate plans. The climate hysteria movement is literally in a meltdown over the growing defections, but the wheels are quickly coming off the a circumflex climate bandwagon. According to the almost comically alarmist UK Guardian, the a circumflex climate extortion demands from third-world dictators and governments of a circumflex become the most explosive issue at the UN Global Warming Summit. Apparently the negotiators have not been reading the news from the real world. The increasingly discredited British paper, which boasts of support from the controversial Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, represents among the last remaining media outlets still uncritically parroting the UN alarmism. Still, its a circumflex reporting offers some insight into the ongoing climate machinations underway in Warsaw. Now, The Guardian reported, the regimes ruling poorer nations are even threatening to a circumflex walkout of the Warsaw talks if Western governments refuse to hand over more wealth extracted from their already struggling taxpayers. The so-called a circumflex least developed country LDC, an alliance of 49 regimes a circumflex including the mass-murdering despot ruling over Sudan and myriad other unsavory rulers whose despotism has kept their populations in perpetual poverty a circumflex are demanding huge sums of loot from Western taxpayers in exchange for supporting the UN a circumflex climate efforts. A circumflex, this is a red line for us. A circumflex, threatened Munjirul Khan, a spokesman for the 49 government outfit, referring to the obscene demand that taxpayers in more developed counties start funneling even greater amounts of cash to oppressive third-world regimes. A circumflex, we have been thinking of ways to harden our position, to the point of walking out of the negotiations. A circumflex, in other words, Western governments better fork over the money a circumflex at least $100 billion per year to start with a circumflex or possibly lose their chance to foist a global carbon regime on the planet by 2015. Meanwhile, the communist dictatorship ruling over mainland China is also ramping up its demands, a circumflex seeking at least $100 billion in climate booty per year by 2020, to be extracted from Western taxpayers. As Reuters reported in an article headlined "A Circumflex Rich Nations Must Pay Up If UN Climate Talks to Succeed. China, a circumflex, the ruthless regime is making threats that are similar to those made by the LDC coalition. According to the communist autocracy as a circumflex chief climate negotiator, a circumflex, Su Wei, if Western governments fail to hand over trillions of dollars to oppressive governments to deal with a circumflex climate change, a circumflex, the UN scheme will not advance. A circumflex, we want to see a very clear roadmap. We want to see the actual and real provision of financial sources, Su whined, demanding more money while calling on Western governments to continue gutting the economy by imposing ever more draconian limits on economic activity under the guise of reducing CO2 emissions. A mere $100 billion per year, a circumflex, would be a very important starting point and key to the successful conclusion of the negotiation of a post-2020 agreement. A circumflex, the Chinese communist a circumflex climate chief claimed. In essence, the extortion threats mean governments in developed countries hoping to expand their powers and impose radical international treaties on their populations must pay up quickly. U.S. State Department documents released by WikiLeaks revealed that the U.S. government and the European Union superstate have long been bribing and bullying third world regimes with taxpayer funds. It appears to have worked, but now the poorer governments are demanding even more. The embarrassing schemes exposed by WikiLeaks were aimed at prodding reluctant governments into foisting a circumflex climate shenanigans on their populations while securing support for a far-reaching global treaty covering every human on the planet. It remains to be seen whether the phony battle in Warsaw will result in Western powers capitulating to third world despots, but resistance to the machinations is growing fast. Of course, if the third world regimes made good on their threats and walked out of the UN summit, perhaps permanently killing the prospect of a global a circumflex climate treaty, it would represent a huge blessing to the world. An estimated $360 billion was squandered on global warming schemes last year alone, a circumflex funds that could have been used for productive purposes in the market, for example, or to deal with real problems like hunger and healthcare. It remains unclear where all of the funds were wasted. However, the prospect of dictators, power-hungry Western powers, and the UN all giving up on their a circumflex climate schemes now a circumflex, even despite the implosion of the alleged a circumflex scientia, a circumflex remains very slim. Instead, as typically happens at UN conferences, the climate dignitaries will work into the night pretending to develop some sort of hard-won a circumflex compromise that benefits all of the governments involved, at the expense of taxpayers and humanity at large. Then they will get back in their CO2-spewing limos and jets to go home. With third world despots emitting increasingly ridiculous demands for hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars for a circumflex climate change, a circumflex, Western governments can pretend like they worked hard to protect their taxpayers a circumflex, all while fleecing them. The climate, meanwhile, will continue to change, just as it always has. But rulers of developed nations can then seize more power over their populations while funding tyranny in poorer countries by handing huge sums to the ruling tyrants and their cronies. It works out well for everyone involved, except humanity as a whole and those paying the bills, of course. The Obama administration has been more than happy to play along, even as credible polls consistently show that a sizable majority of Americans do not even believe the UN's discredited man-made global warming theories. A circumflex, our task now is to fashion a new agreement that will be ambitious, effective and durable. A circumflex, claimed U.S. a circumflex Special Envoy for Climate Change Todd Stern in a recent speech as the EPA was emitting lawless a circumflex climate decrees set to further ravage America's economy. A circumflex, and the only way to do that is to make it broadly inclusive, sensitive to the needs and constraints of parties with a wide range of national circumstances and capabilities, and designed to promote increasingly robust action. A circumflex. Human emissions of the essential, life-giving gas CO2, which is exhaled by people and required for plants, continue to be blamed by the UN for alleged circumflex global warming. Circumflex despite the fact that temperatures have not risen in almost 2 decades, debunking 73 out of 73 UN circumflex climate models. MANA's CO2 output, meanwhile, represents a mere fraction of 1% of the greenhouse gases naturally in the atmosphere. However, with so much riding on the UNA's climate theories, circumflex including the global body's shattered credibility, circumflex alarmists are still maniacally hyping the discredited notions. The end goal, according to the UN, is to foist a so-called circumflex carbon budget on humanity to ration CO2 emissions and to secure a circumflex complete transformation of the economic structure of the world. Circumflex, devastating the poor as well as the global economy. To grease the process along, however, advanced nation governments and regimes ruling in developed nations are plotting together to transfer ever greater sums of taxpayer funds from the citizens of richer nations to the oppressive governments impoverishing poorer nations. Of course, letting the would-be extortionists walk out of the Warsaw summit and turn their backs on the whole scam for failure to deliver enough circumflex climate loot would be ideal. It will not happen, though, unless people and scientists speak out loudly and forcefully against the ongoing swindle. The climate emperor still has no clothes, but the UN and its member governments, operating in a sort of bubble, will continue refusing to acknowledge that fact unless humanity yells it from the rooftops.